Right. So last week we had a look at Sigmund Freud and his ideas around psychodynamic theory and how they developed and evolved. And I mentioned last week as well that we were dealing with what's sometimes referred to as the big three ideas, or the first three waves in psychology, and going in chronological order. So psychodynamic theory was the first wave of these grand ideas, often referred to as grand ideas, or sociologists like to refer to them as grand narratives, because they are an attempt to explain human nature in a very broad reaching sense, with the underpinning idea behind both Freud and behaviorism this week, and humanistic theory next week, that these ideas apply to absolutely everybody. So, not just people in the country where the theory developed, but the entirety of the human race, which, of course, is a very ambitious thing to say, to put it mildly, because it cuts across not only geography, um, people in every country on the planet, but it also cuts across chronology to say that these theories explain human behavior not only in the 20th or 21st century, but 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. So, across pretty much the breadth of human history, these theories are applicable, which of course is very theoretical because unless you have the benefit of a time machine, you can't go back 3,000 odd years to find out if your ideas were definitely still applicable to human beings back then. But we'll park the limitations of research to one side and focus on this second big wave of ideas. So we're going to have a look at one of the major names in the field of behaviorism. He wasn't the chap who started behaviorism, that credit goes elsewhere, but Frederick Burrhus Skinner became known as one of the sort of leading lights in the behaviourist movement. And so we'll delve into a little bit of Skinner's life story, not too much because we're not doing a biography, but just enough to give you a degree of understanding of the kind of chap he was and where his ideas were coming from. And we'll look at some of his key concepts, and how they contrasted or complemented, perhaps would be a better word, the theories and ideas that were um, current in the behaviorist movement that he was participating in and adding to. So they sort of evolved and they developed, and we'll bring it more up to date with ideas that came more into vogue towards the end of Skinner's life and after his death. Um, this is Skinner himself. So he was American born, came from a very academic family, a very accomplished family. Um, a fair number of his relatives were very religious, very Christian. And whilst he himself was an atheist, nonetheless, we could make an argument that certain values, certain concepts from within Christianity did shape his upbringing and his outlook on the world as an adult, even though the sort of what say the more spiritual, mystical elements of Christianity were things that he parted company with. Um, his initial studies were academic studies, were into the realm of English lit, but he soon became maybe a little bored with that, perhaps, and decided that having acquired his initial degree in English lit, he wanted to go on and develop his PhD, his doctorate in psychology, which is a bit of a sizable shift, it has to be said, from the kind of academic approach to the study of literature versus the academic approach to the study of human mind, human consciousness. There are some very marked differences. And when he was doing his PhD, it was still very much the case that Freudian notions were heavily in vogue, being taught and promoted within academia, and that some biological theories as well were very prominent. That people were very keen on studying the brain and the central nervous system and neurochemistry and so forth, gradually moving into the development of studies in genetics that was starting to come more and more to the fore. And so psychology during his student days was a sort of combination of Freudian ideas and biological ideas and early forms of behaviorism. And it's the early forms of behaviorism that really enchanted him, really grabbed him as concepts. That's where he applied himself particularly and started not only to study what pre-existing people, chaps like Thorndike and Watson, what they had argued, but bringing in his own spin, his own variations on the ideas a bit under study. Eventually, he wrote quite a few, a really rather large number of academic articles and books and so on, but he also contributed a novel, which not many psychologists can have as their claim to fame. Usually the concentration is upon academic journals and books and so forth. They don't tend to branch into novel writing, but Skinner did. And his novel, Walden 2, which came out in 1948, was essentially a psychological novel. No, I don't mean that in quite the way that you might say that an Alfred Hitchcock film is a psychological film, sort of a study of the, usually, well, in Hitchcock's case, usually the rather grimmer side of human nature. Rather, that Skinner's novel isn't a novel in the conventional sense, in that there really isn't very much plot to it. There isn't an awful lot going on. Rather, it's a sort of philosophical treatise in which the various characters in the story have discussions and debates with each other and examine different psychological theories and different sociological concepts about how those theories can be translated into social policy and social action. And so Walden 2 is his argument for how the idealized utopian society, or at least it's utopian to him at any rate, if not necessarily to anybody else, how that society would operate along behaviorist lines. So it's not, a murder mystery or a science fiction novel or a western or something like that. Rather, it's this philosophical exploration using fictional characters to bounce around ideas. I don't think it is in print anymore, but you can certainly get second-hand copies of it still. So in terms of what was current when Skinner was a student, the ideas of John Watson were quite in vogue to a large extent, and he found them very inspiring and engaged his interest in all sorts of ways. Watson advanced what he initially described as methodological behaviorism, studying behavior. Now, what makes this the kind of second wave is that a critique that Watson and later Skinner and a variety of other people made of Sigmund Freud's initial approach, his psychoanalysis, is that it was very much geared towards the study of what went on in people's minds, what was going on at a deeper level, and how that could be understood. Things like symbolism and the talking treatments, which were very much part and parcel of Freud, are things that they rejected. They regarded them as, at best, sort of pie in the sky, hot air. That this was a study of things that were largely unstudyable because they were so subjective, so hidden away, that they were nigh on impossible from a scientific point of view to accurately and objectively evaluate. What a person's dreams may or may not have meant to them was like, as far as Watson and Skinner and others were concerned, was like nailing jelly to a wall. It really had very little validity or content to it. What they wanted to bring in, and Skinner was very much on board with Watson's initial arguments in this area, was a very scientific study of human nature. Now, in defense of Freud, he did regard his study of human nature to be scientific, to his standards of science at any rate. And when Freud was developing his ideas, there was nothing really academically to measure his ideas against, because he was pretty much breaking new ground. So when Watson comes along and Thorndike and Skinner and these various other people, they are measuring what they would like to do against the backdrop of Freud. So they do have something to measure themselves against. And they start to find Freud's approach, and not just Freud all by himself, but the followers and adherents of Freud, to be rather wanting on the academic front, on the scientific front. Watson's argument is that you can talk to people, you can ask them about their dreams and all of that, but you can't really know any of it is true or accurate or honest or reliable. What you can do from a scientific point of view is observe behavior. Not what people say, not what they claim to have dreamt the night before or anything like that, but what are they actually doing right here, right now? You can watch it, you can quantify it. They did this thing 5 times, that thing 7 times. They took so many minutes or so many seconds to do so and so action. So you can quantify the frequencies of behavior. You can quantify the time durations of behavior. There are various other ways in which you can quantify and evaluate behavior, but you are measuring things. And it's a key defining feature of positivist science, which most of the mainstream sciences, certainly at this point in history, and pretty much going back many, many hundreds of years prior to this, the almost exclusive focus of science had been on the measurable and the quantifiable. You could characterize science in many respects as being measurement-based. How do we convert what we are seeing, hearing, experiencing into some sort of mathematical data where we can look at frequencies and we can look at patterns? We can compare one set of achievements to another set of achievements from a mathematical perspective. We get on next week to talking about the humanistic approach. Interpretivism comes to the fore. And that's a very different approach to science. Interpretivism is quite popular these days, and not just in psychology. It's acquired a degree of popularity in a number of other academic domains. Some people obviously are great admirers of interpretivism, and that's why it's so popular. Other people, particularly those of the more old school hardline positivist approach, regard it as a load of woolly nonsense and feel that science is often being derailed in pursuit of interpretivism, because that moves away from the measurement-based focus of positivist science into rather more emotional, feeling-based, lived experience-based patterns of understanding and knowing. So there are some sort of clashes of philosophical schools of science and philosophies of science going on between the Freudians on the one hand, the behaviorists on the other, and a couple of decades down the line, the humanistic approach wading into that set of disputed, conflicting ideas. Now, Watson and Thorndike and then Skinner and then a variety of other people afterwards began to focus very heavily not just on behavior and the measurement of behavior, but on the process of changing behavior. That becomes the big sort of driving force, that psychology should not be merely descriptive, making note of what people do and don't do. It should be proscriptive, working out ways in which to change or by which to change other people's behavior. How can we amend undesirable behavior, antisocial behavior? How can we encourage pro-social, desirable behavior instead? What are the methods? What are the techniques for changing people? And so there is this movement towards the study of reinforcement. How can we bring about the kind of behaviors we do want and discourage the kind of behaviors we don't want? Now, you could go off onto slightly, what should we say, philosophical avenues and debate who this we is. Is the we in question Skinner and Thorndike and Watson? Is the we in question modern day living psychologists? Is the we in question government? Is it corporate business? Is it whoever is funding the research? If we get the time at the end, maybe that's an issue that some of you might find interesting and worth reflecting on and considering. But initially, when people like Watson, Thorndike, and Skinner are writing, they're often thinking in a quite isolated fashion. They are the people doing the reinforcing and the changing of somebody else's behaviour. But even so, as per that novel, Walden 2, they are still at the back of their heads thinking, where can this research lead to? Once I've done faffing around in a laboratory and conducting small-scale little experiments, where can these principles, these guidelines, these ideas, where can they be taken, where can they be applied to a much bigger picture? And obviously, once they're being applied on the much bigger level, they're being applied by other people. The genie, if you like, gets out of the bottle, and it's no longer people like Watson and Skinner controlling it. It then becomes governments and corporations and so on and so forth that are determining what behaviourist techniques will be used and to what end they will be used for. Part of early behaviourist thinking is classical conditioning. This idea that behaviour can be shaped. Now, some of the early thoughts are around this classic pattern of conditioning. Skinner then adds to it and takes it off in slightly different directions. But we'll just have a look at the basics of conditioning. Most behaviour, most events can be thought of as unconditioned. They just happen. Things happen. A stimulus is an external event that happens to a person, or indeed to an animal, because a great deal of Watson and Thorndike and Skinner's research was not so much done with human beings, but done with pigeons and dogs and various other animals, and trying to condition their behaviours before they then branched out to trying to do the same thing to human beings. So a random event happens in the environment, such as a clap of thunder. That may be paired with an unconditioned response, something within the human being or the animal that happens. Now, most people, most animals, if they're minding their own business and all of a sudden, out of thin air, there's a big boom of thunder, the first clap of thunder of a storm, it's startling, a little bit disturbing. You jump up, you think, what on earth was that? And look around. So that slightly panicked, startled response is an unconditioned response. If a second stimulus creeps into the picture, and as far as people like Watson and Thorndike and others were concerned, it needs to happen very, very quickly, within a matter of seconds, to become part of this conditioned pattern, then what we start to move away from is an unconditional stimulus and an unconditional response towards a conditional one. So let's say the thunder claps, boom, and 2 seconds later the telephone rings. So you got the frightening event and a neutral event. The response from the frightening event is panic. The early behaviorists began to argue that if this could be repeated, this frightening noise, telephone rings, panic, this triple pattern, if that could be repeated a second time, a third time, it would start to condition to the point where just hearing the phone ring could elicit feelings of panic. You would no longer need the clap of thunder or some other type of big loud noise to disturb a person, because they would have become conditioned to associating the thunder with the ringing of the telephone and their own internal response of alarm, being startled, being panicked, jumping up, looking around, feeling a bit nervous about whatever the big bang was. You could then take away the thunder, you could take away the big noise, and what you'd have is the beginning maybe of some kind of phobic pattern, where a person might start to experience these sensations of nervousness and fear every time they hear a phone ring. Now, if it only happens the once, the thunder, the telephone, the panic, that would not lead to a conditioned pattern. It would need to happen a number of times. How often? Well, that's where a lot of behaviourists get a little bit hazy, a little bit kind of vague, and don't necessarily get down to the details and saying, well, it's got to be exactly 3 times, exactly 4 times, or whatever. But a number, an unspecified number of times, and it starts to form a pattern. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a negative thing. It's the development of a phobic response. It could as easily be a positive thing, the development of a very nice response to something that feels reassuring or induces sensations of happiness or hope or contentment or whatever. But such is the nature of psychology, that people tend to be a little bit more interested in studying the negative than they are in studying the positive when it comes to looking at what's going on. One of the analogies, metaphors used by early behaviourists was that of the black box. Now, frequent plane flyers amongst you may be immediately thinking of the black boxes that you get on aeroplanes. It's nothing to do with that. The image was simply why a black box, not a red box, a green box, a blue box. Doesn't really matter what colour it is. It's just a box. So it's unconnected to aeroplanes. It's just a weird coincidence. So the argument behaviourists were making is that imagine you had a box with a wire going in it and a wire coming out it. You could see the stimulus going down the wire into the box. You could see the response coming out of the other wire out of the box. What you don't see, what you don't know, is what goes on inside the box. And so the human mind is a little bit like a box. The psychologist, the observer, can see the stimulus, like the clap of thunder. They can see the response, the person jumping up and looking a bit panicked and a bit neurotic. What they cannot see is the thought processes or the emotional patterns going on inside that person's brain in the split second it takes for the thunder to roll and the person to jump up looking nervous. They're not arguing, we need to be quite clear on this, they are not arguing that nothing happens inside someone's mind. Not at all. They're just saying you can't see it. And therefore, from a positivist scientific point of view, if you can't see it, you can't measure it, you can't study it, you can't make objective statements about it, what's the point talking about it? It's a waste of air. It's a waste of time wittering on, does the person think this, does the person think that? Do they have memories going back to when they were 6 years old? Do they this, do they that, do they the other? It's all pointless speculation. It might entertain people like Freud, but what's the point of it? It contributes nothing to the scientific study of what's being examined. In order to condition the behavior of a cat, a dog, a horse, a human being, or whatever, you don't need, at least according to the early theorists, you don't need to be able to know what's going on in their mind. All you need to do is match the stimulus with the response. Do it often enough that you form a behavioral pattern, you then have control over that person. You've conditioned them in some way. Famous example, of course, is Pavlov in Russia, doing his experiments with dogs. Got a few dogs in a cage. He rings a bell, puts the food in front of the dogs, and the dogs go woof, 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 and eat the food. And as dogs are wont to do, they get a bit dribbly and saliva comes out when they're eating their food. After a while, do that 2 or 3 or 4 times, it gets to the point where you just ring the bell and immediately the dog's going woof, woof, woof and dribbling, because they are anticipating food. As Pavlov himself pointed out, once you've formed the conditioned pattern, you don't need to supply food every single time the bell goes off. You'll still get the woofing and the dribbling, even if sometimes they don't get fed. Now, it was also noted by various other people that if you just stop bothering to feed not starve them to death or anything like that, but you cease to pair the feeding with the bell, eventually that behavioral pattern will disintegrate. And it'll reach a point where the dogs stop woofing and dribbling when the bell goes off, because they've realized that the last 10, 12, 15 times the bell's gone off, no food appeared. So the association dwindles and dies. So whilst you don't need to do it every single time, you do need to do it reasonably often enough that it sustains the reinforcement of the pattern of behavior that you've created. So it's understood in that kind of a way. Is the dog having a thought process about food and bells? Possibly. Pavlov would argue, who cares if the dog is thinking? You can't observe what the dog is thinking. Why waste time talking about it? What you can observe is the stimulus, the response. Measure it. Job done. So that application that's put onto dogs, onto pigeons, onto various other creatures is also put onto human beings. Don't waste time talking about what's inside the box, just look at the ins and the outs. So I know at least some of the people tuned in at the moment are either studying counselling or have qualified in that area in the past. From a therapeutic point of view, the focus is on changing behaviour, not on working out the history of the behaviour. So if you were doing a diet plan, or to get somebody to lose weight, or you were trying to get them to quit cigarettes or quit booze or whatever, you look at the stimulus that goes into them from the environment, what triggers off the eating, what triggers the smoking, what triggers the drinking, the behavior that comes out, the eating, the drinking, the smoking, whatever it is that you're trying to change. You understand the pattern, and you then have to take away the reinforcer. You have to take away the linkage between the two. Various ways you can do that, such as, for example, trying to pair up a different pattern, introduce a different pattern. You remove the reward from one thing and you transfer the reward onto something else. So if smoking is rewarding, if drinking is rewarding, if eating donuts is rewarding, can you take that away and pair the sensation of reward with them doing some other behavior that you would prefer them to do? Eating celery instead of eating donuts. God, that's sadistic, isn't it? Anyway, transfer the behavior somewhere else. Now, Skinner, Watson, and the rest of them would have been thinking in terms of behavioral rewards. It's just as easy to think of it in terms of neurochemistry. So common treatments for people trying to quit alcohol and quit smoking are medications which make the experience of drinking alcohol or consuming nicotine unpleasant. Instead of it being a rewarding experience, it becomes associated with a very unpleasant sensation, and that breaks the pattern of wanting to do it in the first place. That still fits, even though it's a chemical process of some kind of medication, rather than a conditioned behavioural response in the more old-fashioned early behaviourist sense. Nonetheless, modern-day behaviourists would still regard that as a form of behavioural conditioning, a form of behavioural intervention to disrupt an unwanted pattern of behaviour, drinking, smoking, whatever, and replace it with a more desired pattern of behaviour. And most of them will agree, especially modern day ones, that this process is most effective if you replace behaviour A with behaviour B, rather than just try to get rid of behaviour A and then leave it with nothing to fill the void. It's more effective. Studies have shown that success rates are higher where there is a replacement of one behaviour with another, rather than simply the cessation of a behaviour. Boy, and again, at no point would a behaviourist bother to ask that person about their childhood associations with smoking, about their childhood memories of eating donuts or whatever it was. They wouldn't be delving into any of that kind of slightly Freudian avenues of early patterns of reinforcement, of symbolism, of what does this bottle of vodka unconsciously mean to this person. They wouldn't be interested in any of that, because as far as they're concerned, A, it's not reliable, the information you get, and B, it's not helping you to change anything by getting the information anyway. So it's a focus purely on what this person does rather than what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're dreaming, what they're imagining, or any of that. Okay, so this issue of reinforcement, the term, when it's used by behaviourists rather than when it's used casually by people on a day-to-day basis, has a slightly different meaning, in that you can think of a reinforcement as both positive and negative. Casual conversation, we tend to think the term, often use the term reinforcement in a more positive way, to reinforce a good thing. But a behaviourist can talk about negative reinforcements as well as positive reinforcements. So a reinforcement is a way of sustaining a behaviour. Now, that behaviour, from a behaviourist point of view, is invariably neutral. It could be described as pro-social or antisocial or whatever, but behaviourists rarely use excuse me, rarely use words like good and evil. They tend to just think that behaviour is behaviour. Either it's socially desirable or it's socially undesirable, but it's kind of treated in a much more neutral. If someone, like the guy in the photograph there, is exhibiting undesirable behaviour, there's some kind of antisocial behaviour, violence, or maybe he's robbing banks, engaging in sex crimes, domestic violence, whatever it is that he's getting up to. The argument is he's only doing that because over the course of a stretch of time, possibly months, possibly years, it's variable, but a stretch of time, he has done that behavior previously. And when he has done that behavior previously, it has been reinforced. There has been some advantage, some gain from doing that behavior. The more it is reinforced, the more likely he is to do it again. So if he went out on the very first time to rob a bank and it all went horribly wrong and he suffered terribly, or it was a total flop and there was no reward whatsoever, no gain, nothing, it was just a bit of an indifferent flop, then he would be very unlikely, at least according to behaviourists, to go out and try and rob a second bank or a third bank or a fourth bank. He'd only want to do it a second, third, fourth time if the first time there had been at least some gains to it. And obviously, very simplistic, I appreciate, but perhaps the primary gain is the money that he's run off with. There might be other gains too, a feeling of power, of excitement, of this, that, and the other. But that all starts to get a little bit nebulous from a behaviourist point of view. So they're more likely to focus on the concrete gains, the cash that he's run out of the bank with. So that becomes a reinforcer. So if you're working in a prison, in rehab, partly you're working out what is the reinforcer, what has this person gained from committing a string of crimes? Can we uncouple the reinforcer from the crime so that in future, if this chap or woman, for that matter, engages in the antisocial behaviour, they don't get the reinforcer? That's going to lead eventually to, in terms of using the jargon term from within behaviorism, it's going to lead to extinction. The behaviour becomes extinct because they no longer get the reinforcement that they're looking for from the behaviour. You might then think in other contexts, after you've uncoupled those two things, could that desired behaviour be coupled with, desired outcome, desired reinforcer, could it be coupled with some more pro-social type of behavior. So they can still get the money or whatever it is that they're after by doing something else that's a bit more socially acceptable. That becomes an option. Punishment, negative reinforcement is a factor here. Negative reinforcement is when you do something and there's a horrible consequence and you don't like it. Later thinkers, including Skinner, began to more actively recognize the importance of tailored reward and punishment. In other words, what serves as a reward for one person might not necessarily work for anybody else. Therefore, one size fits all approaches to reward and punishment is rarely effective because it's not really tailoring to each person's needs. And given that we've got a photograph there of a prisoner, the criminal justice system is perhaps a really good example of that. That whilst for many, many, many people, I'm sure prison is a horrible prospect and something that they would dread being packed off to prison. Clearly, recidivists who are in and out, in and out, in and out of prison, for them, maybe it's not that much of a deterrent. Maybe for them, they actually quite like it. There's been plenty enough studies of recidivistic behavior that for many people, they go to prison, they've got a roof over their head, they're getting food on their table, they've got friends to chat to, they don't have to pay bills, they don't have to put up with their awful family. It gives them actually positives, unintended positives, but positives nonetheless. So it reiterates this idea of behaviorism that one reward or one punishment will not match absolutely everybody. You've got to be a bit nuanced about these things if you're delivering them on a big scale. So what else? Replacement behavior. So from a behaviorist point of view, rehabilitation within prisons is about replacing a behavior people don't like with a behavior that seems much more socially desirable. So you take away the rewards for one thing and introduce rewards for the second type of behavior, the one you do want. In prisons, it's often referred to as a token economy, where prisoners who do as they're told and they're obedient and so on, they get rewarded with chocolate or cigarettes or whatever kind of thing that they desire. So they get some kind of reward system that encourages socially desirable behavior. If anyone has small children or works in a primary school or whatever, they're gold stars on a chart and the kids get patted on the head and told they've done really well. It's the same thing. It's a token economy. Same basic idea of rewarding desired behavior, which is all well and good, it has to be said, but all of the evidence suggests that as soon as people leave prison and they're on the outside, they're no longer getting the pat on the head and the rewards that they've been after. The behavior patterns that have been sustained while they were in prison very rapidly fall away. So again, we're back to Pavlov and the dogs. If you stop matching up the food with the bell, then after a while, the dogs will stop going woof woof and dribbling all over the place. They will twig that they are not going to get rewarded. Sooner or later, it might take a while for them to twig it, but they will twig it. Therefore, the same is true of human beings. We rapidly realize that we're not going to get those rewards anymore. So what's the point of doing the behavior? There is no sort of internalization of moral conscience, which is what Sigmund Freud was arguing, that when you're very small, mum and dad nag you into doing certain things, but eventually you internalize their voice so that by the time you're an adult, at least in theory, you no longer need mum and dad to be hovering over your shoulder saying, don't do this, you must do that, or you're a naughty child, go and stand in the corner or whatever. You no longer require that physical presence because it's internalized, it's part of your consciousness, or in Freud's case, your unconsciousness. The behaviorists are not interested in the unconscious mind. They're not interested in measuring anything that cannot be concretely seen and observed and stuck under a metaphorical microscope to be studied. So there is no kind of factoring in of that as a possibility, as an element. Other factors with, well, skirted around a bit. The chronological adjacency is just psychobabble for quick. If you want a reward to work, make sure it's given very soon after the desired behavior. That's true for training dogs to do tricks. It's true for small children. Is it true for older children? For adults? Well, maybe something we can chat about at the end. Some behaviourists would argue, yes, it is true, no matter the age of the person. Others start, particularly people like Bandura, who give a great deal more focus to conscious processes, will argue that the rationality of older children and of adults is such that we understand chronological adjacency very, very differently than the way that small children, or indeed dogs, or sea lions at the circus, or whatever, the way they understand things. Consistency is that you have to provide the reward often enough, or indeed provide the punishment often enough for it to become effective in shaping behavior. You can maybe skip the odd time or two on the reward front, or skip the odd time or two on the punishment front, and it's still effective, but go for too long a period of skipping and the pattern is broken. Consistency is lost. People like Bowlby and Ainsworth also noticed this when they were studying small children, particularly babies. Very inconsistent, erratic parenting is extremely disturbing for children. Consistent parenting is much more impactful for small children. Children like to know where they are, even if where they are is possibly not a very pleasant place, but at least they know where they are. I've heard adults arguing much the same about prominent politicians, that even if so-and-so is a complete unpleasant person, at least they are consistent, at least you know where you are with them. Whereas other prominent politicians maybe chop and change their views with the wind, and so the electorate never know where they are from 1 minute to the next with an individual. And as a species, we perhaps are quite fond of consistency, of knowing where we are. And I've already mentioned this idea that the reward, or indeed the punishment, does have to be relevant to the person. So I don't smoke, so there'd be absolutely no benefit to someone trying to reward me for good behavior by offering me a packet of cigarettes. I wouldn't want it, so it'd be useless to me. Something else, bag of fudge or something like that, would be much more effective. So it's tailoring the reward or tailoring the punishment to match the individual. Now, Skinner comes along and he tweaks the research in this area and brings in a concept that he calls operant conditioning. So he's not disagreeing with Watson and Thorndike to any massive extent. He's just sort of building on the groundwork that people like that have already laid with their research into classical conditioning. His shift is to focus on the notion of voluntary behavior rather than autonomic behavior. So autonomic behavior, things your body just tends to do without much thought on your part. Voluntary behavior, where you have to start applying thought. And he argues that the whole of life is not just what strange people in white lab coats and clipboards get up to in laboratories. This is a description of just life generally. So a kid learning to ride a bike doesn't necessarily need an instruction manual on how to ride a bike. Maybe an older brother, sister, parent, uncle, aunt, whoever, to give them a few tips to get them started. But chiefly they will learn by doing it. They'll work out that if they put their foot in the wrong place, they'll fall off the bike and graze their knee, and that hurts. And so they decide, right, I won't put my foot there anymore. I'll put it somewhere else. And gradually, by successes and failures, rewarding experiences and painful experiences, the combination of the two, a person can learn, if I put my hand here and my foot there and I do this and I do that and I do the other, that is going to enable me to go on a bike ride, or enable me to drive a car, or bake a cake, or do whatever it is I want to do. I've learnt by essentially trial and error. So operant conditioning is fundamentally it's trial and error, is what it boils down to. Understanding that this is how we learn most things. That there is a conscious bit of us thinking, and if I do this, if I do that, and making reasoned connections, it still is going with this black box idea that even though he's acknowledging the sort of consciousness observing outcomes of behavior, he's still going along with the idea that you can't scientifically really study that process of thinking and reasoning. So although it's there, it's not observable. So again, let's not waste time talking about it, is pretty much the conclusion he comes to. One of the risks, and it's a difficult risk to get around in behaviorist thinking, is that of false association. So part of this kind of conscious thinking is I have just done X, so and so Z has happened as a result. I am connecting doing X to getting Z as an outcome, which is great if you make that link accurately. The cake got burnt because I left it in the oven 10 minutes too long. It's a sensible, rational linkage. You understand, next time I bake a cake, I'll take it out of the oven 10 minutes earlier. Makes sense. However, there's lots of stuff going on, lots of stuff we're doing. And sometimes people, indeed quite often, arguably, people will link one factor to another factor, one event to an outcome, and the linkage is mistaken, it's false. There is no association between the two things. So I bake a cake whilst wearing green socks, and the cake burns. Has my wearing green socks caused the cake to burn? Well, obviously not. But let's say I don't know that. To me, it's not obvious. And so I start to think to myself, right, next time I bake a cake, I'll wear yellow socks. I better not wear green socks because that causes the cake to burn. Which is a weird example, I'll grant you. But there's plenty of sporty people who come to convince themselves that the reason they won their last match was because they were wearing their lucky socks. So they always have to wear their lucky socks at every match they go to. No end of students take their teddy bears and whatnot into the exam hall because the last time they passed an exam and got a good grade, they had their teddy bear on the desk and now it's their lucky teddy bear and it helps them. Is there a logical, rationalist explanation for how that teddy bear somehow helps them pass an exam? No, there's not. Freud might argue, emotional states puts you in a relaxed frame of mind. Maybe you've got positive associations with that teddy bear and your lovely old granny who gave it to you or whatever else. So Freud would come up with some kind of an explanation for that. But from a much more science-based process, there is no direct link to why having a certain pair of socks or a teddy bear on the desk or whatever should guarantee an outcome. So that is a false association. But people argue it's the basis of most weird superstitious belief. The person has convinced themselves, if I do X, Z happens, when there's no connection. But they think there is, and so they keep doing it. Skinner would like to get rid of false associations and live in a world where everyone is terribly rational and terribly sensible, and no one goes around doing bizarre false association behaviors. But it is a fundamental kind of risk of human nature that we will link the wrong thing to the outcome and then repeat that instead of linking the correct thing to the outcome and repeating that. I've already mentioned the animal research, so we'll skip that. So he comes up with a set of 4 factors, all of which can operate in various degrees. The 2 most effective are the 2 in the left-hand column, reward and punishment. So positive reinforcement, you do a behavior and you get a desired reward for it. Desired as in tailored to you. You want that reward, you like that reward, You get given it, job done. Most of us go to work and get given a pay packet at the end of the month. We desire the money. For a lot of people, it's probably the only reason they go to work, because they don't get much else out of it. So from the pay packet, but it's a desired outcome. It's a positive reinforcement, and so society engages in an awful lot of positive reinforcement. We say to people, if you do X, I'll give you Z, and you want Z, so you go and do X. Job done. The flip side is positive punishment. If you do X, I'll hurt you. How am I going to hurt you? Well, could send you to prison, could punch you in the face. I could do something equally unpleasant. I'll find some horrible thing to do to you. And it is horrible to you. So going back to what we were saying about recidivist prisoners, if getting sent to prison is better than sleeping in a shop doorway because someone's homeless, then that's not an effective punishment for them, because it's actually an improvement of their situation. So what is a punishment for one person may not be a punishment for everybody. So it's got to be kind of linked to the individual. But you do the undesirable behavior, the antisocial behavior, and a horrible thing happens to you. I say antisocial behavior. It's simply any behavior that the person providing the punishment doesn't want. Doesn't necessarily have to be antisocial in some kind of collective, measurable, objective sense. It's just something they don't want. So let's say you've got a parent who is really doesn't like noise. The child is singing, which many parents might enjoy hearing their child singing, but this particular parent doesn't. And so every time the child sings, they slap the child. Even if the child is singing in a very nice voice, it's very melodious, etc., they still slap the child because they don't like it. So there is nothing in and of itself that's antisocial about singing, except that this particular parent doesn't want it, doesn't like it. So it's quite arbitrary what gets rewarded, what gets punished. Slightly less effective are the two on the right-hand side of the screen. Negative reinforcement. There is something horrible going on, and if you do the behavior I want, I'll take that horrible thing away from you. So as a bit of a grim example, Guantanamo Bay has been operating as a prison for quite a few decades now, operated by the American government. And the inmates, we're told, obviously I've never been there, but we're told, frequently have incredibly loud music played at them. Ear-splittingly loud music that goes on and on and on and on, and must drive them insane, I should imagine, after a while. If the inmate is willing to answer the questions put to them by the interrogators, then the offer is that the music will be turned off for a while. That's a form of negative reinforcement, taking away a horrible thing. Or indeed, slightly less extreme example, if a prisoner is told, behave yourself, do everything you're told to do, and we'll knock a few months off the end of your sentence and you can go home early. That's a negative reinforcement as well. A negative punishment, quite a popular thing to be used by parents and teachers, well, kind of, or of younger kids at any rate, not so much older kids, but younger kids, losing something you like. So again, we'll stick with the prison example. If a prisoner is told you've broken the rules, therefore you're going to lose your hour a day in the prison yard, enjoying a bit of sunshine, you'll be kept locked up in your prison cell, that is a negative punishment. It's taking away something that is preferred, something that's enjoyed. Having to pay a fine, a speeding fine or something like that, is a form of penalty because you're having to give up something you'd much sooner keep, the cash. They work to a point, but the first two work more effectively, according to quite a long variety of studies that have been done in various different cultures, because it's quite important to compare across culture and not just assume if you do this study with one group of people, it's automatically going to apply the same results to every other group of people on the planet. So there's been cross-cultural studies, and they tend to find with a reasonable consistency that the positive reward and the positive punishment work most effectively. And of the two, reward versus punishment, reward is more effective than punishment. People will go for longer periods of disruption in which they don't automatically get the reward every single time, but they keep hoping maybe next time, maybe next time, maybe next time. They'll last out for that longer than disruptive punishments. So if they don't get punished every single time, they might start to think to themselves, well, hey, I've gotten away with this one, I might get away with it again. So that's the effectiveness of punishment doesn't last if the delivery of the punishment is disruptive, whereas the effectiveness even of reward lasts longer even if the delivery of the reward is disruptive. Obviously, this is all terribly abstract and academic, but the reason of giving examples from prisons and schools and so on is because essentially most social systems work along these rather behaviourist lines, whether we're talking schools or prisons or the army or all sorts of other situations. There are systems of reward and punishment, positive, negative, and otherwise, that are used to regulate human behaviour. So this is just a sort of a social standard. So the positive reinforcement is more effective than the other three. Worth bearing that in mind. This chap is Albert Bandura, still with us. He developed social learning theory and was particularly keen on the idea of role modelling, that is to say, observational learning. So whereas Skinner, with his operant conditioning, is talking about trial and error, the kid learns to ride a bike by trying to learn to ride a bike, getting on it, pedaling away, falling off it, working out why they fell off it, getting back on it, trying to do it again, only better. Bandura argues that a huge chunk of learning is monkey see, monkey do. I'll watch somebody else doing a thing, and then I'll have a go at doing it myself. That's an awful lot of television. That's, all those cookery programs and DIY programs and things like that. We watch an expert chef cook a meal, and then, at least in theory, we go and have a crack at cooking the meal ourselves because we've seen how they do it. Children monitor their parents constantly. Little boys will stand next to dad of a morning, and when dad's shaving, the little boy will pretend to shave, that sort of thing. It's observational learning. And often it's noticeable that sometimes people get to their teenage years or adulthood, and there's certain things they've never learned to do because they've never been able to observe it. So it's not uncommon in my experience to have young men who can't put on a tie because either their dad's never worn a tie or they don't have a dad in the first place. So they've never had the chance to watch him putting on his tie. Therefore, they don't know how to put on one of their own when it comes to a graduation ceremony or something similar. So observational learning, or the lack of it, can lead to some significant gaps in terms of what people are able to do. He highlights quite a number of factors, and social learning theory is fairly involved, so I'm only giving you a tiny little snapshot of it here. But he says, first off, we have to attend to what is happening. We have to know that someone is doing something. If you're too busy looking in the opposite direction, you're not going to model something that you haven't really paid any attention to in the first place. So you've got, first off, to pay attention to it. Second off, your brain has to be healthy enough and capable enough and well nourished enough that it can retain information. If you've got Alzheimer's or severe malnourishment or syndrome from a lifetime of alcoholism, then your brain is not likely to retain information. So you've got to have the kind of wet works there in the first place to retain the information. And then you've got to have the wish to do so. I could watch somebody playing football. I'm still not going to go out and do it, because I find football incredibly boring. So just watching it isn't going to make me want to go and do it. There's got to be the motivation there that you want to be like the person you're observing. So this whole kind of process of observational learning, it has a big impact on things like how you teach. It's arguing that a very fundamental form of teaching is not someone doing what I'm doing to you right now, just sitting there waffling away for hours on end. Rather, a significant chunk of teaching should be demonstration-based teaching. If you're going to learn to cook, the chef stands in front of you, they make a meal, you then repeat the process and make the meal yourself. Or somebody teaching garage mechanics, they have their hands in a car engine doing stuff, you watch them, and then you go and do it. So whatever subject you're teaching, arguably, from a kind of teacher training point of view, think about, is there a skill set that I could demonstrate in the classroom? Students can watch me do so-and-so thing, and then they can go and do it themselves as well. Doesn't lend itself to everything. Obviously, subjects like psychology and sociology and history are more ideas-based than they are skills-based. But even so, there may be still some skills that can be demonstrated and that can become part of the learning process, part of the imitation process. And a key point that Bandura is wanting to make goes back to this black box, that it's there. And whilst you can't saw the top of somebody's head off and watch the thought process is taking place, it is nonetheless worth psychologists giving serious academic thought to what's going on in someone's mind to be able to infer what they're thinking, even if you cannot directly observe it. Because what you will infer is vital to understanding the nature of learning. Whether that's somebody learning to do a very positive thing, like bake a cake, or whether it's somebody learning to murder, rape, rob banks, do some other god-awful behaviour. You have to understand the mental processes going on in that person's head. That's vital, especially, says Bandura, if you want to change their behaviour. If you're just having an academic waffle, that probably doesn't matter very much. But if you want to change human behaviour, you give consideration to the black box and what goes on in the person's mind. Another big element of his theory is the argument around efficaciousness. He says we all, in as much as you can ever say that about humanity without studying the entirety of humanity, that we all, or at least most of us, desire to be efficacious. We want to go through life believing that we can do things well. Now, clearly not everyone can do everything very well. Even the cleverest person on the planet is going to have some things they're a bit rubbish at. But we like to do things well. Whether it's playing sports, painting a picture, building a brick wall, making a dinner, whatever it is, we like to do things well. We like to feel we can be effective. And so there is a kind of instinctual urge in us to get better at doing things and to find things that we can do well. There's a meme that does the rounds on social media, which is attributed to Albert Einstein, that suggests if you ask a fish and a giraffe and an elephant to pass a test by climbing a tree, then clearly they will do very badly. But if you ask the monkey to climb the tree, it'll do very well. And therefore it's unfair to judge the elephant or the fish by the standards of what the monkey is good at. If you only ever get evaluated on things that you're a bit rubbish at, you'll go away feeling that you're completely useless at everything. So again, back to applications in education, applications in parenting, find things that kids are good at, and it builds their sense of confidence. It builds their sense of being efficacious, of being capable. And for Bandura, thinking you're capable is half the challenge. If you think you're rubbish, you won't even try in the first place. You'll just give up before you start. If you think you're at least capable, then you'll give it a good go. I mean, it might turn out you're a bit crap at that particular activity, but at least you'll give it a good go. You'll feel it's something that is worth you trying to do. Otherwise, you won't even try in the first place. Now, this breaks down into a number of stages, and I'll try and get through this bit quickly so that we can then open to a Q&A. Already mentioned that you've got to be paying attention to someone in the first place. You've got to be looking at them, observing them, monitoring them, but not just looking in their direction. You've also got to have some degree of what we might very loosely call positive feeling towards the person. Some reason for wanting to be like them. Now, this could be because you genuinely love them, you care about them, you think they're a smashing person, you really want to be like them. It can apply to people you don't really like, so long as you admire them. So even if you think they're a bit of a horrible person, you have some kind of admiration. It could be based around fear. It could be based around the sense that, yes, they're a bit horrible, but they're very effective at doing what they do. So it doesn't always have to be a warm, cuddly emotion, but there has to be some sense of, I want to be like that person. Not necessarily in every single thing that they do, but in certain key areas. I want to have the skill set that person has. So the child, or indeed adult, who is doing the looking, the observer, they have a reason to observe. We've mentioned already the kind of the functionality of the brain. You've got to be capable of remembering the information you're looking at. And I suppose you've got to be looking at the right bits. So going back to false association, if you're paying attention to irrelevant things, then your learning process is going to be a great deal slower than if you're paying attention to the key relevant parts of the individual in terms of the skill that they're performing. Once you've observed it, you then have to be physically capable of doing the same thing yourself. If I observe somebody juggling apples, I've got two hands, so I'm physically capable of juggling. I've probably dropped them, but theoretically, I'm physically capable of reproducing the motor actions involved in juggling apples, so I could do it. If I didn't have any arms at all, or they were both broken or in plaster casts, and I couldn't actually do it, then no amount of observation is going to be any use on that front. So I've got to have the physical capacity to reproduce. And the motivation is the sense that I can see a purpose for observing this behavior. Why do I want to learn that skill set? Well, that's a separate issue from whether or not I like the person performing the skills. So again, I could really like a particular footballer and think they're a really lovely person, but I still don't want to learn to play football. So I don't have the motivation, even if I pay attention to the person. So I've got to have both. Now, obviously, we've been talking in things like riding bikes and baking cakes. It's all fairly straightforward. Going back to the prison topic from earlier, it could be that the behaviour observed is really quite nasty behaviour. I'm observing someone who's very violent, very abusive, very dangerous. I'm watching them building bombs or doing some other kind of horrible thing. And do I imitate? Do I follow? Well, Bandura's argument is that if the behavior seems to work, then very likely you will want to imitate it, at least if you're a small child and you're not quite at the level of adult rationality yet. So if a small child observes their older brother punching somebody in the face and taking a bag of sweets off them and walking away, the older brother's violence has been rewarded by getting the bag of sweets. It has worked as a behavioral strategy. It's not a nice behavioral strategy, but it has worked as a behavioral strategy that's been rewarded for what they do. And so if the younger child thinks, oh, I'd like a bag of sweets too, what they have observed is an effective strategy for acquiring it. Even if they don't really like their brother, they've learnt an effective strategy for acquiring a bag of sweets. So potentially that motivation might then lead them to go and thump somebody and take their sweets off them. And obviously, as they get older and older, it's probably not going to remain a bag of sweets. It will turn into wallets and purses and other things that they might want to acquire. And so they're learning that physical violence is an effective way to get what you want, which isn't a very nice thing, but let's face it, it's true. It's a lot of people, if you thump them or at least threaten to thump them, they will give in to you. They will do what you have demanded of them. It's why domestic violence works again and again and again, because you threaten to hurt someone, frequently they will cave into you and give you what you want. So it becomes an effective strategy. So it's part of changing unwanted, unpleasant behavior is working out what the kind of reward system is to it in the first place and being able to bring in some alterations on the basis of that. Wiener notes that there's got to be a degree of cognitive processing in which the observer recognizes the skill set as something they can acquire rather than something they can't acquire. So I can't sing for the life of me. I sound like a cat falling down a lift shaft. I'd love to be able to sing, but so far I haven't managed. Do I believe that musical talent is innate? You're born with it. Either you've got it or you don't. Or do I believe that musical talent can be learned and acquired by hard study? And whether the answer is yes or the answer is no, that will determine whether or not I'm likely to try and acquire musical skill in the first place. So I could listen to people who've got amazing voices and think, if they're born with it, I wish I was born with it. And if I think that, I'm not going to try and imitate. Whereas if I think, oh, that's a learned skill, if I go and join a music class, I could learn it too. I'm more likely to go and give it a go. Marx, not Karl Marx, a different Marx, and Cope looked to this idea of imitability, people feeling that they will more likely learn something if the person they're observing is somehow similar to themselves. Although it's a bit vague, to be honest, when they're talking about what class is a similarity. It's the bedrock of a lot of marketing campaigns that if you want to appeal to teenagers, you should put a teenager in the advert or the poster. If you want to market something to a particular ethnic community, put a model from that ethnic community in the TV advert or the poster, that people respond to similarity. But it's a little bit vague as to similar in what way. That's a bit inconsistent, a bit unevaluated. Huseman and Kerwell talk about this idea of attribution bias as being a learnt phenomena as well, and part and parcel of learning theory, that we learn how to attribute what's going on around us, and that kind of determines the patterns we will develop. So if I'm down the pub and somebody jogs my arm and I spill my beer, do I automatically think, oh, you did that deliberately, you swine, and thump them? Or do I automatically think, God, you're clumsy, and ask them to buy me a new pint? So do I attribute a hostile motive to the other person? Do I attribute clumsiness or whatever else to the other person? That process of attributing, they're arguing, Huseman and Cowell, is also a learned process. We observe what others attribute and we start to attribute the same. Okay, so time-wise, I could talk a little bit more, but I'm going to try and shut my trap so that we've got a little bit of time in which to go over any questions and deal with any comments. I'll just check on the chat there. Okay, no one's typed any questions. So does anyone have anything that they would like to ask? Or indeed type now in the chat section. Reflections, thoughts, stuff you agree with, disagree with, didn't quite grasp, would like more of an explanation of. For those of you who were here last week, do you feel more inclined to Freud or more inclined to behaviorism at the moment? Or neither? Yes.
Can I just ask more for the clarification of these four elements, like positive reinforcement and positive punishment? My question is, well, all those four elements were proposed by Skinner, or somebody else later categorized?
The four factors are chiefly Skinner's idea, although quite a lot have gone along with him and fully agreed in that approach. So it's not exclusive to him, but he kind of put it out there as a framework for understanding the reward and punishment process in the first place. It's, I think, reasonable to say that human societies have been using that system, even if they've never described it in that language until fairly recently, but they've been using that framework since ancient times for running judicial systems, for parenting, for all sorts of systems whereby we reward and punish and take away rewards. And the idea of removing a negative situation is less common. That sort of Guantanamo Bay situation of answer our questions and we'll turn off the horrible music doesn't get used as much. But the other three historically have been used again and again and again and again, even if they weren't always described in the terminology that Skinner uses to describe them. So partly it's a result of his sort of engagement with animal training. Most of his research was done with animals rather than with human beings. But also it's part of his just sort of historical observation of the world and the way in which social systems work. That as a species, that's I'm sure people get sick to death of me trying to work theology into everything, but let's go a little bit down the theological line. A number of religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc., will argue that there are certain forms of behavior that God rewards and certain forms of behavior that God punishes. So if you do the good things, you get the reward, and if you do the naughty things, you get sent to hell or whatever, some sort of punishment visited upon you. Atheists like Richard Dawkins come along. They make the argument that if the only reason, I'm paraphrasing here, if the only reason someone doesn't go out and commit murder is because they're scared that God will send them to hell, then they're probably not a very good person. If the only reason they don't do a thing is fear of punishment. The reason we should be kind and nice and lovely and smashing is because they are desirable behaviors. So put it in a slightly different context, there's an American philosopher, Michael Sandel, who talks, amongst many other subjects, about the nature of money and the impact of money. For those of you with kids or grandchildren or nieces, nephews, whatever, if you said to a child, we're going to go and visit Granny, and I want you to be nice to Granny, and if you're nice to Granny, I'll give you 10 quid. Is that a good form of parenting? Michael Sandel says no, because that kid should be nice to Granny because it's their Granny, not because they're being bribed to be nice to Granny. That the instant you put a reward into the picture, you are corrupting a social relationship, which ought to be born out of genuine affection and not just using Granny as a means to get 10 quid.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's the argument that what motivates human behavior? Are we only motivated by reward and punishment, which is pretty much where Skinner is coming from? Or are we, idealistically, ought we to be motivated by higher principles, which is kind of what Richard Dawkins is arguing. We ought to do things. Michael Sandel would add, we ought to do, visit Granny or whatever, out of goodness, out of kindness, out of compassion, out of very high, noble moral principles, not because we've been offered a reward. So even if there was no heaven, no karmic lovely goodies awaiting us in the future, if it's good, it's good, and we should do it anyway. If it's bad, it's bad, and even if we never get caught, we never get punished, we shouldn't do it. So if you could absolutely guarantee you could murder a person and never get caught, never go to prison, never go to hell, never have any negative comeback, do you think to yourself, right, get that axe, I'm off to commit that murder and get away scot-free? Or should there be a bit of you that says, this is wrong, I will not do it, even if I am absolutely 100% guaranteed to get away sans punishment? For Skinner, it's reward, it's punishment, that's it. That's human nature. There you go, job done. Other people, a bit more idealistic, arguing that we are capable, even if we don't always do it, but we are capable of being motivated by higher concepts separated from reward and punishment.
But is reinforcement in some way a form of manipulation? Because
Yes.
you can create certain reactions.
Absolutely. And kind of a key argument for all of the behaviorists is that reinforcement is separate from, divorced from morality. So you could, Skinner has this, again, paraphrasing, it's not word for word a quotation, but has this thing where he says, give me a child, a small child, and I will give you back a brain surgeon or a mass murderer. In other words, you could take anyone and make them anything with the right set of rewards, the right set of punishments, the right set of reinforcers. So from his point of view, we're all blank slates. Any single one of us could be turned into Jack the Ripper. Any single one of us could be turned into Mother Teresa. You need is that manipulative set. What would reinforce this behavior? What would reinforce that behavior? What's going to make this child more likely to be violent? What's going to make that child less likely to be violent? And it is quite manipulative. But you could, if you've got the morals of an alley cat, turn anyone into anything, if only you work out the correct system of rewards and punishments. And thankfully, it is all theory and hot air. I don't think anyone has seriously had a go at doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Yet.
Can I just say, Robin?
Yeah.
Thank God for Bandura. Is that his name?
Mm-hmm.
Thank God for Bandura. I mean, basically, thinking about it, that it seemed that Skinner in the beginning was kind of reducing the human being into a thing or a commodity, or that can be manipulated, if you like, without any sense of morality, any sense of ethics, any sense of right or wrong. How, to me now, how can anybody reasonably think that the brain is a black box, and it's not worth, it's not worth even going there, because we are all so diverse and made up of our mental processes, which all feeds into our behaviour. On that instance, I do go along with Freud.
Well, modern day, bearing in mind Skinner's been dead a while, modern day behaviorists are much more open to the idea of neurochemistry as an observable event.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have technology now that didn't exist in Skinner's lifetime that enables measurement and observation, brain scans, various different things that enable us to monitor the brain much more effectively than any of the technology available in Skinner's lifetime enabled people to do.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't come free of problems. clearly, if you wire somebody's brain up to measure what's going on whilst they do an activity, it's a very unnatural situation. And it kind of begs the question, are you monitoring them in their natural state?
Yeah.
Or are you monitoring them in a very self-conscious, what are these weirdos in clipboards and lab coats and
because it's all been
things
set
stuck
up,
on your
hasn't
head?
it?
And absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also it's we're not like the primates in the wild, where lots of anthropologists or zoologists or whoever, they can observe them in the wild and see what their behaviour is. But
Yes.
Unless you want a scientist sitting in your corner in your living room day after day, it's not very practical, is it?
Not really, no. So it's a lot of it is kind of slightly pie in the sky theory rather than applied reality. But a lot of institutions are very keen on behaviorism and reward and punishment and incentives and discouragements and so on. Whether it works or not is a separate issue, but they are certainly very keen on it. There is a kind of an economic factor at play here. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which draws a lot on behavioral concepts, is a damn sight cheaper than 25 years of Freudian analysis. If you're having to finance treatment, there is an element of that going on there.
Many a discussion has been had between counsellors and people that do talking therapists and CBTers, who absolutely believe that it works. I mean, and probably on one level it does, but on another level, you often find people who have had CBT are not happy with it. On the surface, it may well work, but then it seems to sort of, then other things start kicking in, and then they go out and they seek talking therapies because there's something about human beings that know that there's something not quite right, and it's not just surface behaviorism.
It doesn't get to the root of issues. I mean, it certainly is a treatment for addictions.
Does not get to the root of human beings' mental health issues,
which is a problem in itself. There's two typed questions. I'll just quickly cover them. One about the black box. So it is just expanding and recapping on this idea that for early behaviorists, less so for Bandura, but for early behaviorists, the workings of the human mind are unobservable. And in order to maintain a positivist scientific approach, if you cannot observe it, why waste time trying to? Becomes a key question. So it's not that they don't think people have emotions and thoughts and feelings and all the rest of it. They just argue you can't really observe them in any honest fashion. Therefore, just ignore it and focus on what you can scientifically observe, which is performed behavior. So you can see how often a person does a thing. What you can't see is why they're doing it, what they're thinking about whilst they're doing it. You can only observe what they do. So it's a shunt away from interpretivism, or what is sometimes also called phenomenology, into a focus on more positivist scientific applications. And at risk of sounding terribly cynical again, positivist science gets better funding than interpretivist science does, or at least up until very, very recently that has been the case. So, if we're filling in grant application forms for research projects, you get more chance of a decent chunk of money if you can describe what you're doing in a positivist manner than if you can describe what you're doing in an interpretivist manner. There's a bit of that going on there. So the mysteries of the mind fundamentally is what the black box is about. If you can't look into somebody's head and see what's going on, behaviourists argue, why bother? Just focus on something you can observe. Slightly different direction. And there's another question there about kids raised in the same same household, turning out quite differently from each other. A behaviourist would defend their point of view by suggesting that even identical twins raised in the same household will not be raised in absolutely 100% identical manners. They will have slightly different experiences from each other. They will be treated slightly differently by mum, by dad, by uncle, by auntie, by granny, by whoever else. Therefore, even though they look alike, even though broadly speaking they've had the same dinners and been bought similar clothes to each other and all the rest of it, there will be sufficient differences to account for why they turn out differently from each other as adults. A geneticist would have to make a similar argument, especially about identical twins, where you've got exactly the same genetic patterns in both brothers and sisters or whatever it is, that there are differing environmental factors, not absolutely the same, but differing ones leading to different outcomes. Freudian wouldn't feel any great need to see this as a mystery to tackle, why two kids growing up in the same household grow up differently. And Freudian would say, well, of course they do, because they're different people. They have different relationships. Even if they are quite close in age group, they will have different relationships from each other, different experiences, different systems. A humanist would say something quite similar on that front, that they are exposed in different ways. So even if the parents put their hand on their heart and say, I swear we treated both the brothers, both the sisters in exactly the same fashion, the behaviourist would say, did you really? Probably not. There would have been subtle differences to account for why things, different impacts on behaviour, different impacts. This one is rewarded in a slightly different way, and this one is punished in a slightly different way, and that's what accounts for the different functional adults that brother, sister, whatever they are, turn into as adults. Are there a little bit of time left? One more question, and then I'll have to go back to marking essays. No? Okay. If anyone would like the PowerPoint or the recording of this week, or indeed the recording from last week, then please drop me an email or leave a message in the chat, and I'll send stuff across to you. Failing that, oh, thank you very much, nice message. Failing that, hopefully I'll see most of you, if not indeed all of you, next week for the final one, where we'll be looking at humanistic theories, people like Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Rollo May, and a few others, as they developed their ideas as they went along and came in as what's referred to as the third wave, the third force in psychology, in contrast to the Freudians and in contrast to the behaviorists. And the nutshell, there you go, a bit of an advert, a bit of a sales pitch. Freud is looking at all of the dark subconscious motivations behind the perversity of human behavior. Behaviorists, as Carol rather suggested in comments there, have a tendency to see human beings almost like robots or trained poodles in a circus who can be conditioned to do as they're told. The humanistic approach sees people as free will, possessed of choice, possessed of positivity, possessed of the ability to grow and flower and flourish into something joyful. It's not all weird, sleazy, incestuous fantasies or conditioned poodles doing tricks in the circus. It's a much more glowing view of human nature. So yes, same time, 2:00 next Tuesday. And if anyone doesn't have the link for next Tuesday, again, drop me an email and I'll send you the Teams link for next Tuesday as well. Nice to see you all again, and take care, and hopefully see you next week. Bye-bye.